Hello, my name is Tangen, representing ALHT, the Norwegian School of Leadership and Theology, and soon you will listen to my chapter about greed.
The purpose of this chapter is to provide practical, theological and philosophical reflections on how greed relates to organizational leadership. I will investigate this relationship by means of three questions. What is greed in light of the Christian tradition? How does it affect organizations in the late modern world? And how should organizational leaders deal with greed? In this explorative reflection, I begin from the perspective of the Christian tradition and then engage in dialogue with other academic disciplines that are considered useful to the task. What is greed? In the Christian tradition, the English term greed is a translation of the Greek word philarguria and the Latin word avartia. In Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, avartia seems to refer primarily to the undisciplined pursuit of money and material wealth. Yet, Aquinas notes that according to the earlier Christian philosopher Augustine, the Greek word for avarice, philarguria, can apply to anything that is desired immoderately. In the broader Christian tradition, avartia can also denote stinginess, ungratefulness, insatiableness, and an unquenchable desire for fame and glory. I will suggest that one should define greed both in attitudinal and behavioral terms. In this chapter, I will therefore explore greed not only defined as the undisciplined desire for money and wealth, but also, in the broadest sense, as the undisciplined pursuit of other resources relevant to organizational leadership. Following the British theologian Graham Tomlin, I find it useful to make a distinction between greed and what I would call responsible self-interest and ethical ambitions. Tomlin describes proper self-interest in terms of embracing and not abandoning the responsibility of taking care of ourselves and those who depend on us. He defines what I will call ethical ambitions in the following way. Ambitions, likewise, is healthy and vibrant, spurring us to achieve more, not wasting our lives, but making them count in some way, hopefully towards something good and worthwhile. These notions of responsible self-interest and ethical ambitions are, in my view, not incompatible with the principle of equal regard or a vision of a just society. Yet, although self-interest and ambitions are different from greed analytically, it is much harder to make a clear empirical distinction. As Tomlin suggests, self-interest can soon shade into forms of greed. Self-interest becomes unethical when greed takes over and initiates an unlimited pursuit of more, so that it ignores the moral principle of equal regard. Equal regard may be understood as loving one's neighbor as oneself. However, it's worth noticing that in the Christian tradition, this also includes sacrificial efforts to restore genuine mutuality and community. In contrast, greed sacrifices the needs and interests of others in an undisciplined pursuit of more. Thomas Aquinas suggests that this kind of avarice is a destructive sin for two reasons. It is a sin directly against one's neighbor, since one man cannot overabound in external riches without another man lacking them. It is a sin against God, just as all mortal sins, inasmuch as man condemns things eternal for the sake of temporal things. The first reason is social. Greed leads to an unjust distribution of goods. The second reason is theological. Greed turns material things into the ultimate concern instead of God. If we perceive it in more universal terms, greed deprives us of spiritual values, regardless of what religious or philosophical tradition we belong to, because it leads us to desire wealth instead of what makes life more meaningful. Graham Tomlin points out that this is in fact to represent a distortion of natural enjoyment of physical pleasure, since it takes place without a meaningful and moral context. Without such a context, our desires may develop into what Joseph Piper calls a freely chosen compulsion. Here we face a third reason for why greed should be considered dangerous. It is also a sin towards oneself. As Graham Tomlin argues, greed always consumes. In particular, it consumes the person it takes hold of. It is never satisfied and is always hungry for more. This observation might be equally important on a macro-sociological level. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman suggests that most late modern societies are on the move from a solid modernity focused on production to a more liquid forms of modernity based on consumption. This implies that individuals now primarily define their identity in terms of what they consume. If Bauman is correct, we must ask ourselves existential questions as to which degree consumption, and perhaps undisciplined consumption, should define who we are. This is obviously an important question, since undisciplined pursuit of commodities threatens to destroy the environment and the future of humanity. Here, several moral traditions may provide critical resources for our reflection. How greed destroys our humanity is brilliantly presented in the old Greek myth of King Midas. The king of Macedonia was known for his extravagant riches, but his wealth did not satisfy him. Midas once did a favor to the god Dionysus, and when the god asked him of what reward he would like in return, Midas immediately wished that all he touched would turn into gold. His wish was fulfilled. All he touched was transformed into beautiful gold, including his wife and children. He had become immensely wealthy, but all he had was gold. Thus, despite of being rich, he fell into a depression and had to ask Dionysus to take back his blessing. The Jewish philosopher and psychologist Salomon Schimmer suggests that through this myth, we see how greed dehumanizes us. As we become preoccupied with things in terms of monetary worth, we lose the ability to see things for what they really are. Thus, the claim that undisciplined pursuit of more is dangerous is therefore not unique to Christianity, although it should be said that Christian theology extends this claim beyond this life. I do not believe that fear is a sufficient medicine for greed. Søren Kierkegaard has taught us that moral life projects are far more important. Yet, images of greed as a deadly sin may inspire us to ask questions about greed with a sense of fear and trembling. What will happen to our environment, our societies, our relationships, and our organizations if we let this deadly sin dominate our life?